There is a fundamental, almost existential question that all of us face, and this is how fascism made such a ferocious comeback. And most importantly, why do we misunderstand it? I am, for example, from Pakistan, and I can say with confidence we have a very limited and very superficial understanding of fascism. We say it's all about creating the other. Well, why is the other created? By whom? In order to achieve what? And in order to conceal what? The questions that need to be addressed are what is so different and what is so distinct about this fascism that we currently face? Why has it emerged now? What and who is fueling this fascism? How is it sold to the people? And importantly, what can we do about this fascism? And doing something about this fascism really requires understanding this phenomenon in the very first place. Actually, when I was listening to you, and as I said, like this point is quite often debated here as well, that why the industrial revolution and the invention of machine happened in England. And when I was reading you and listening to you, you had put this point on the table that actually the Englishmen were trying to somehow compete with the Indian textile, and for that reason they were searching for ways to innovate, and that actually led to the invention of machine. Have like I understood this point correctly?
Yes, that is true. For a very long time, Indian textiles were imported by Britain, but not for the British market.
Mm-hmm.
Indian textiles were imported by were imported by the East India Company to be sold in the European market. They were not allowed to be sold in the in the British market. British market was completely protected from the import of Indian textiles. So much so that if there was somebody who was actually found wearing cotton textile products imported from India, that person was fined. So you had very strict import controls, and it is only on the basis of that protection that machines were developed at a very long period of time. And when machines were developed, then those manufactured goods produced by the machines of cotton textiles were then actually sold in countries like India and China and gave rise to a massive deindustrialization, which was the cause of the pressure of population on land and the magnitude of rural poverty that we observe today.
Mm-hmm. When I was reading your book, I think you had noticed this point as well, that this category of imperialism, like increasingly becoming, what should we say, like obsolete. Like people are not enough using this category of imperialism, and when they do use this word imperialism, they just mean, for example, the hegemonic U.S. Force on countries like Pakistan. So they don't figure in that this process of imperialism, in which something is extracted from the global south, actually continues. So can you explain this idea of imperialism? What is it? How is it like understood today, even including among the left?
Yes. You see, in general terms, imperialism is a term we use to denote the fact that any development of capitalism requires control over a hinterland. Without it, it's not possible. This control over the hinterland is for selling your products abroad, which is what Rosa Luxemburg emphasized. It is for obtaining all kinds of materials which are not found locally, but without which production cannot take place. And therefore, this control over the hinterland is something that we call imperialism. Economic theory pretends that actually there is, as it were, trade to the benefit of each country in acquiring these food grains, raw materials, and so on. But that's completely nonsensical because these countries, like let us say India, China, and so on, are countries that did not really, I mean, that were more or less self sufficient, self contained, that didn't really require a lot of foreign goods. They had a very diversified production structure and they had to be deliberately, forcibly opened up to trade. And this is something which was actually done by imperialism.
Hmm. Okay.
You
So,
see, China, you take the case of China.
mhm,
Chinese tea was imported, not only tea, but let's say Chinese tea was imported by Britain.
mhm,
But on the other hand, Chinese did not want any British goods. Therefore, what was done was to cultivate opium in India. India was made to produce opium. China was made to consume opium, and therefore the Chinese British trade was settled by Indian opium, which was for which a market was created in China. In other words, the Chinese didn't want British goods, but they were made to consume Indian goods, that is opium, in order for Britain to settle its accounts vis-a-vis China.
yeah, and yeah, again, you when I was listening to you, you had said that Britain, for example, would keep intact its inflation and other sorts of things because of the system of colonialism. And now when we discuss this category of capitalism, we are completely ignoring it. We have just this idea that there are certain creative people who are creating wealth, and for that reason society as a consequence progresses.
The point is that imperialism as a category is as relevant today as it was 200 years ago. Of course, the precise way in which capital accumulation is sustained by imperialism changes through time. For instance, I mean, I'm not for a moment saying that imperialism is a set of relationships that remain unchanged through time, because obviously the kind of mm, manufactured goods that for which a market exists in countries of the global south, that market is not as significant for the global north today as it was 200 years earlier.
Yes.
Obviously, because of the fact that we don't provide such an important market today for American or British goods. But on the other hand, when it comes to raw materials, those continue to be as important as before. Similarly, let's say in food grains, I think the global north produces a lot of its food grains. So of course, it does so by providing huge subsidies. But on the other hand, it does provide food grains for its population and has a surplus. But on the other hand, a whole lot of other goods, let's say beverages, fibers, and so on, are goods which it cannot produce, and therefore it depends on the global south. And one of the concerns of contemporary imperialism is to actually convert land use in the global south from the production of food grains to the production of goods that are demanded by them. Okay,
Mhm.
which basically means that the peasants must be forced to change the land use
Mhm.
that they generally currently have. So the nature of imperialism changes, but the fact that capitalism in its hinterland, which means in the global north, cannot exist, cannot function without the import of a whole range of commodities which they cannot produce except by importing them from the global south, that relationship remains unchanged.
Mhm.
Which commodities and so on obviously changes through time, but on the other hand, that overall relationship of capitalism requiring a hinterland, that remains completely unchanged.
Yeah. So this point of dependency, that it is not only the global south which is dependent on the global north, for example, for as we say like technology and these sorts of things, but there's also a dependency of the global north on the global south when it comes to, let's say, food. And this is also like a very unequal relations. For example, like if we say that we are exporting food and we are importing actually those modern tech product, let's say, and other machines. This is again like a very unequal relationship which keep us in that lower point in social hierarchy.
I would like to just make one point. We are not dependent for technology on the global north in the sense that we cannot produce this technology. I
Okay.
believe an effort is made in the global north to ensure that we remain dependent for this technology upon them. In other
Okay.
words, the global south is made to be dependent on technology or for the global north. I'll give you one instance. For instance, let us say in India, there used to be an Indian Patents Act.
Okay.
And because, that actually under that, there was a lot of innovation that took place, particularly in, let's say, the pharmaceutical industry, so that India produced a lot of drugs and so on. Under the recent neoliberal regime, WTO, that Patents Act had to be changed, and the TRIPS, the trade related intellectual property rights regime that came into being now ensured, for instance, that in the old Indian Patents Act, for instance, a patent could be for 7 years. Now it is for 20 years. So
Mm-hmm.
that that during 20 years you cannot develop this product. So that
Mm-hmm.
these are ways of forcing you to remain dependent on technology imports from the global north. So it's not as if we cannot develop our own technology,
Mm-hmm.
but it is the fact that the global north retains its grip on technology and ensures that the global south remains dependent upon it.
And this could be also like an aspect of imperialism, that grip on technology is kept intact in order to keep us in that lower point in the in the hierarchy. Like this could also be an aspect of imperialism as well.
Yes, of course, of course. Uh, but the kind of things, I mean, one of the things after independence that you had, let's say in a country like India, was an attempt to build up technological self-reliance, so that a lot of the goods that you required were goods that you could actually produce. But on the other hand, that technological self-reliance has been destroyed over time under the neoliberal regime. Firstly, through making, through the imposition of patents and making um, these countries their own patent strips compatible, which basically means that abandoning a lot of the effort that they had made towards self-reliance, and secondly, of course, by throwing open their markets to the import, to the unrestricted import of goods,
Yeah.
which basically means that they cannot protect their own industries and therefore cannot develop their own technology. I told you earlier that, as a matter of fact, the Industrial Revolution came after a very long period of protection of the British market against imported textiles. But that kind of protection is now overturned under the neoliberal regime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would like to come to this question of neoliberalism as well and understand it from the standpoint of are in relation with fascism as well. So about capitalism, when I was reading you and listening to you, there were 2 points actually that you had made, that you cannot have capitalism without imperialism. And the second thing is
Correct.
about immiseration. You had said that even Karl Marx like underplayed that point of immiseration under the system of capitalism. So consequently you cannot have capitalism with a human face, as we call it.
Yes, absolutely. I believe that is absolutely true. And look how that proposition is getting daily vindicated today. After the Second World War, there was generally an idea floated that, look, capitalism can be made into welfare capitalism. In the advanced countries, you have capitalism providing a whole range of welfare services and facilities to the working class. At the same time, because of decolonization, you now no longer have that ugly colonial relationship. Third world countries can develop the way they like. But on the other hand, look what has happened, because that is a regime that so-called regime of progressive or welfare capitalism is a regime that came to grief in the late 1960s, early 1970s, because for a start, it gave rise to massive inflation domestically. And because of the fact that if the working class is over a period of time, you have high levels of employment, then of course the struggle over distribution of the product becomes intensified.
Mhm.
Trade unions become stronger. If for 20 years you have close to full employment,
Yeah.
then trade unions become stronger. So that manifested itself in terms of an inflationary upsurge. And this inflationary upsurge also meant that, that a lot of third world countries' commodities also obtained much higher prices. Therefore, you had a kind of, an engineered recession in the advanced countries that created unemployment, that brought down primary commodity prices,
Yes.
except oil, because in oil, a cartel had been formed in between, which actually jacked up the prices. But for the rest of the third world, you actually had a collapse of primary commodity prices. Therefore, all the propaganda which had been developed about welfare capitalism, that the third world can develop the way it likes, is propaganda that was gradually obliterated. In other words, it was shown to be vacuous. Africa and Latin America were made to open up their economies and were made to abandon what I would say their state managed industrialization drives earlier in the 70s and 80s. And of course, India had to do that in the 90s. And as a result, the entire global south was opened up for neoliberalism. And
Mhm.
neoliberalism entails a reassertion of imperialism.
Yes, yes, yes. That was the question that I wanted to ask next. Like that had I felt actually. So the first point is that this idea of welfare state is a bit of misnomer when it comes to capitalism, because you had said that this when the working class actually gets empowered, they would the very system of capitalism then is in danger, and the system of neoliberalism comes into being in order to disempower the working class, in order to disempower the people. And that neoliberalism is actually, as you said, like a resurgence of imperialism. I think you do have the privilege, at least in India, I think, to discuss these points of imperialism and these issues. In Pakistan, these points are like not at all debated at all. These are never put on the table. So there is like a complete consensus on this issue of on this point of neoliberalism. So if you want to have like Pakistan economically developed, you follow those neoliberal dictates. And from your standpoint, it is actually the resurgence of those imperialist policies, and they could never ever bring any advantages to the people, at least to the working people.
No, this idea that if you wish to develop, you must have neoliberalism is a completely wrong idea.
Mm-hmm.
Because uh, what does development mean? Development means an improvement in the conditions of life of the majority of the people. Okay. Now, during the period of neoliberalism in India, absolute poverty in terms of, let us say, nutritional deprivation and so on, has actually increased. As a matter of fact, before neoliberalism came, okay, let me just put it properly in the historical context. If you look at per capita food grain absorption in undivided India
Mm-hmm.
had declined very sharply in the last 50 years of colonial rule for which we have data. From, let's say, roughly 1900 up to the time that our countries became independent of colonial rule. Very sharp decline, at least 25%, perhaps more. In fact, it was about 200 kilograms per person per head at the beginning of the 20th century, and it declined to 138 kilograms in 1947. So you have a very sharp decline. After independence, you actually had, because of efforts undertaken, now I'm talking about India, not
Mhm.
united, not undivided India, because of the efforts undertaken by the government, this was actually raised. This was raised not to the level which the country had in 1900, but roughly to about 184 kilograms by the end of the 1980s. But then during the neoliberal period, first there was a decline, then an increase, but the per capita food grain absorption today in India is actually less than at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the
Oh.
1990s. And what is more, within it, you find, I'm talking about per capita, you
Mhm.
find that there's a rise in absolute poverty because more of it is consumed in the form of processed foods and so on by the richer segments of the population. If you look, for instance, at the proportion of the population that actually has access to only less than 2200 calories per person per day in rural India, this proportion was 58% in 1993 4, and it came down to 68. I mean, it went up, the proportion went up to 68% in 2011-12, and by 2017-18, it went up to 80.5%. So people are becoming worse off under neoliberalism. Now, you may have high GDP growth rate, but you
Yes.
actually have a situation of enormous increase in inequality, which is for which I can give you plenty of data.
Mhm.
And of course, therefore, the ordinary people are no better off today than they were at the beginning of neoliberalism. By which I mean, of course, there is, you have medical developments, antibiotics, you have surgery, but that's technological development. But in terms of their real purchasing power, that's
Mhm.
no higher.
Yeah, and it reminded me of a points that was made by Utsa Patnaik actually, like the hold up ideas. So when you have certain ideas in your mind, even if the material reality is completely changed, you are not seeing the reality. And it also, like, once again made this politics of economics a bit clearer to me, and the politics of the people who speak about economics. So as you said, like, even if the situation, actual situation of the people is getting worsened, and just few people are getting rich, we say that the whole nation is getting rich, and let's
Exactly.
celebrate. Let's celebrate.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
mhm. Yeah, so
I would also like here to say that, that the whole of economics, the whole of the economics profession and so on is really so ideologically formed that you don't get an idea of the truth. That most of the economic theory, for almost every bit of economic theory you have, looks at the capitalist economy as a closed system in which,
yeah.
and so the fact that capitalism requires to dominate the world outside is something that doesn't even enter into
Mm,
any model of capitalism that economic theory discusses.
yeah.
And if you're caught professionally suppose you are an economist, then you have to keep parroting those words, otherwise you would be victimized.
Okay.
Otherwise you wouldn't get a job, you wouldn't get tenure, you wouldn't get anything, you wouldn't get a promotion.
Yeah.
So there's a tyranny of the profession which actually carries forward the kind of wrong ideas that the profession propagates. So it is not only in, let's say, Pakistan or India or any of these countries that the wrong ideas are floated, but this is a general universal fact.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And do you, like, as I started from the first point, that within Pakistan you could say certain regions, certain places which are quite developed, let's say for example Islamabad, but you could also see certain places where you would not see any signal of development, or like the signals of modern life. So like this distribution of people into different categories and regions is also like essential to the very system of capitalism, like as it is on the global scale, so within countries, within nations.
Yes, I mean, I would put it this way that look, the anti colonial struggle in the global south had meant a multi class struggle. You know, let's say we take the Indian subcontinent. In the anti colonial struggle, the peasantry was an important part, the working class was an important part, a lot of urban middle class intelligentsia were an important part. The national bourgeoisie, that means even the capitalists, joined in the anti colonial struggle.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, what is happening now is that the divide is now not between the third world country as a whole and imperialism, but a very important segment of the third world country itself is now integrated with imperialism. I mean, let's say the
Yeah,
big capital.
yeah,
The Indian big capital itself is global.
yeah.
It is really itself a part of the whole kind of, globalized finance capital.
Hmm.
Similarly, a lot of the Indian upper middle class is really a part of, they get jobs in multinational corporations. Whenever you have a relocation of activity from the global north to the global south, they
Yeah.
get jobs, and therefore they have a vested interest in defending neoliberalism,
Hmm.
which has improved their condition. But on the other hand, it has definitely worsened the conditions of the peasantry, of the working class, of the petty producers, which means craftsmen, small shopkeepers, small capitalists, and so on. And therefore, the divide is within the nation.
Yes.
Divide is inside the country, not a divide between the third world country as a whole, more or less, and
Yes.
imperialism.
Yes, and as you had made this point in your book as well, that it's actually a new phase that we are in, like a new phase of imperialism, sort of some sort of. Now, as you pointed out, as you mentioned now this term big capital, and so we live under the system of neoliberalism, which actually benefits this big capital only, and this big capital is actually related to fascism as well as the system of
Oh, yes,
neoliberalism is. So I would like you to
yes.
map this relationship a bit as well.
Yes, you see, neoliberalism is one that generates a lot of that greatly widens inequality. If you look at the World Inequality Database that, for instance, Piketty and others have set up,
Mhm.
according to that, in 1982, the top 1% of of the Indian population actually had access to, or kind of accounted for only 6% of the total national income.
Mhm.
Now, this compares with the fact that at the time of independence, the top 1% accounted for about 12 to 13% of the total national income. So there was an improvement in income distribution. But today, the top 1% accounts for 23% of the total national income. So
Mhm.
there is an enormous increase in inequality. Now, this is something which is not confined only to India. This is true in every country under neoliberalism. So neoliberalism accentuates income inequalities. And when it accentuates income inequalities, since the rich consume a smaller proportion of their income than the poor, you actually have a decline in consumption relative to total output. And that
Mhm.
gives rise to what Marx had called a crisis of overproduction, that there's not enough demand
Yeah.
relative to the amount you produce. And this shows itself, therefore, in a cutback in production and a cutback in employment, growing unemployment, slowing down of the growth rate, and so on, which is exactly what we have been witnessing after the artificial stimuli provided by US asset price booms, like the dot-com bubble in the 1990s, housing bubble earlier this century, were exhausted. Now, in a period of crisis, neoliberalism requires some kind of an ideological prop. You see, earlier, even when people were becoming better off, there was this idea that was floated that look, you are at the moment becoming better off, but wait, we are having such high growth rate that sooner or later it'll really trickle down to you. But on the
Yes.
other hand, the growth rate itself falters when people see unemployment rising. Obviously, they no longer can have that kind of an optimistic view of the future.
Mhm.
And that is when neoliberalism or the monopoly capital, big capital that dominates these societies, being integrated with globalized capital, global finance capital, requires additional support to maintain its hegemony. That additional support, in my view, is provided by an alliance with neo fascism,
Mhm.
which basically means that you pick out some kind of hapless minority group. It could be a religious minority, like in
Yes.
India, it could be an ethnic minority, it could be a racial minority, it could be immigrants, and so on. You pick out a kind of minority group and you generate hatred against it among the majority.
Mhm.
And therefore, that provides an alternative discourse altogether. Discourse is now no longer about employment and so on. It is about the fact that, let us say, kind of this ethnic or religious minority is really something which has been humiliating us for centuries, is responsible for our current bad kind of conditions, and therefore you generate hatred against it. And whole politics, therefore, gets sidetracked from issues of material life. And of course, any such neo fascism necessarily implies an oppressive state. That if you don't kind of, toe the line of the state, you can get arrested, which we have seen in India, which we are seeing now in the United States.
Yes.
People are just being thrown out of universities, deported, and so on,
Yeah.
uh, and even arrested just for supporting the cause of Palestine.
Yes.
So you find that there's the oppression of the state, and this oppression of the state is backed also by oppression by all kinds of hoodlums that the neo-fascists bring with them,
Mhm.
and a very close relationship between monopoly capital and neo-fascism. For instance, the whole idea that neo-fascism has of how to revive the economy is to give tax concessions to big capital. Now,
Yeah.
big capital doesn't invest just because it gets tax concessions.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the whole idea is a very close relationship between neo-fascism, neo-fascist elements, and monopoly capital. And within that, an even closer relationship between some new monopoly elements and neo-fascism, like in India, the Ambanis and Adanis and
Mhm.
so on. So you find, therefore, that sooner or later neoliberalism moves towards a kind of an alliance, an entente with neo-fascism, which is what we find, in which case people now not only feel economically the pinch, not just of neoliberalism, but a crisis hit neoliberalism,
Yeah.
but politically are also oppressed because they cannot really raise their voice against this, cannot organize themselves against it, and so on.
Yeah. So, uh, as you just mentioned this term called trickle down, and whenever I hear this word trickle down, I think of Ayub Khan. This idea
Mhm.
was very prominent even at that point in time, that this thing will trickle down and everyone will be ultimately better off.
Yeah.
The consequence was, we East Pakistan got alienated and ultimately like separated. And this point of oppressive state, you quite often we said that under the system of neoliberalism the state is actually weakened. But I just now thought a bit about this point, that like, to play some meaningful role in the lives of people, that role is actually weakened, but the oppressive nature of the state is actually more strengthened
Yes.
by the.
You,
Mhm.
you see, I would like to bring to your attention the fact that why this oppression? After all, you know, I mean, why neo-fascism? After all, the whole Keynesian solution to a
Mhm.
capitalist crisis is that the state could intervene and get rid of the crisis by
Mhm.
enlarging the demand. Even if
Yeah.
people's consumption is becoming less, state expenditure could increase in order to ensure that unemployment does not increase, in order to ensure that the slowdown is overcome. But you see, neoliberalism prevents it because neoliberalism implies that we have nation states on the one hand,
Yes.
but we have international capital on the other. It can move from one country to another.
Yes.
Therefore, unless the nation state listens to international capital, capital would flow out of the country, especially
Mm-hmm.
finance will flow out of the country. Now, in order for the state to be active in enlarging or successful in enlarging aggregate demand, the state must finance its expenditure either by taxing the rich because
Yes.
they save a lot of their income and therefore there is some net increase. If the
Mm-hmm.
state taxes the rich 100 rupees, then 50 of it would come out of savings, 50 out of consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And when the state spends these 100 rupees, then it increases demand by a full 100. Therefore, there's a net increase in demand of 50.
Mm-hmm.
Alternatively, the state doesn't tax anybody, which basically means it enlarges the fiscal deficit.
Yes.
In that case, you would
Mm-hmm.
again have the state increasing the level of aggregate demand through its expenditure. But both these, namely taxing the rich and enlarging the fiscal deficit, are frowned upon, are objected to by globalized finance,
Yeah.
because of which they do not actually because of which the no nation state, as long as it's open to neoliberalism, which means financial flows across country borders, free financial flows, can really overcome the crisis
Mm-hmm.
the way Keynes had thought it could. And it's for that reason that it actually has to have an alternative discourse provided by neo-fascism.
Mm-hmm.
Neo-fascist elements exist in many modern societies, but the neo-fascist elements come center stage only when monopoly capital picks them up, provides them financial support, provides them
Yes.
media support, and so on, and brings them center stage. So that is the situation we are currently in. But the point is, even the neo-fascist state, for the very same reasons, cannot overcome the crisis because,
Yes.
after all, it too is, after all, a nation state
Yes.
confronting globalized finance capital. So it cannot enlarge the level of aggregate demand through either enlarging the fiscal deficit or taxing the rich. If anything, you look at what Trump is doing, he's actually cutting back on state expenditures.
Yes.
You look at what's happening in India, exactly the same. Concessions are being made to tax concessions are being made to monopoly capital to stimulate investment, because of which expenditures of the state in other avenues are being cut.
Mm-hmm.
So it cannot, even neo-fascism cannot overcome the crisis that neoliberalism has got into, the crisis because of which neoliberalism has an alliance with neo-fascism. But for that reason, it seems to me that if we have to overcome both neoliberalism and neo-fascism, then, I mean, the crisis generated by neoliberalism and the politics of oppression of neo-fascism, then we have to go beyond the neoliberal framework altogether. That
Mm-hmm.
we have to actually de-link ourselves from this neoliberal framework.
Oh, so this delinking could mean, for example, that like doing away with this international system, which is currently neoliberal. And I have heard certain people who would say that if any person would give this idea, that would actually mean that you are reversing yourself back to that nationalism which ultimately led to fascism, like the 1930s and 19 that sort of nationalism. Like people associate this idea with that nationalism, which ultimately led to fascism as well. So, what's your take on this point?
No, no. You see, there is a big difference between European nationalism and anti-colonial third world nationalism. The nationalism of Europe, there are at least three important differences. Firstly, the European nationalism actually always found within the nation some kind of a minority that it put the nation against. In
Okay.
Northern Europe, that minority was Catholics. Okay. In Southern Europe, it was Protestants. Everywhere, it was the Jews because they were supposed to be kind of, a minority group which was different from the majority and against which the majority was turned. So European nationalism always had a kind of, object of hatred within the country. Secondly, European nationalism was imperialist from the very beginning. In
Okay.
other words, you actually had within, European nationalism began with the Westphalian peace treaties in the 17th century. And within weeks of the Westphalian peace treaties, you actually had Cromwell invading uh, Ireland, which was the first colony, first modern colony. And thirdly, European nationalism put the nation above the people. The people were only
Okay.
supposed to make sacrifices for the
Yes.
nation.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
While anti colonial third world nationalism really was completely different in all these three respects. Firstly, it was comprehensive because, after all, it had to be. You are fighting a major power and you had to unite the whole people against it. Secondly, it had to be, I mean, it was not imperialist, on the contrary. It actually was fighting imperialism,
Yes.
and therefore it had very good relations amongst themselves. For instance, pan Indian nationalism had very good relations with Indonesian nationalism, and so on. So that, you had across the third world solidarities
Yes.
that were formed. And thirdly, you did not have the nation above the people, but you actually had the nation's interest being identified with the people's interest. The whole purpose of national liberation was to improve the conditions of the people.
Yeah.
So those who say that cutting yourself off is something which would, or delinking from neoliberalism, would actually mean that in some sense you become nationalist and therefore fascist. That is completely wrong, because fascism was a product of European nationalism, which was diametrically opposite to the third world anti colonial nationalism that united people and that really did not that did not lead to this kind of hatred against a minority. In fact, the hatred against the minority, as I was arguing earlier,
Yes.
has arisen under the neoliberal regime.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like once again, this put to my mind the roll-up ideas. Like we do speak about nationalism, but the idea is actually substantiated by not our own experiences, but by the experiences of the West. And now we like still think along those lines. When I was listening to you now, and as we were speaking about fascism, don't you think that this thing we call fascism is actually also very much related with the system of capitalism? Because if the system of capitalism requires that certain people would remain unemployed, that certain people would remain like in a situation, in a socially depressed situation, that big capital or anyone else who benefit from the system will actually justify the system to the people who are socially depressed, underemployed, deprived. And that would actually mean you target another person or a group of people or whoever that might be, and you said that those people are responsible for your situation and not the system. So like this thing we call fascism is actually, don't you think, then also related with the system of capitalism?
Yes, I mean, of course, fascism is a part of capitalism, but not all capitalism is necessarily fascist. It's not as
Hmm.
if capitalism throughout its history has been fascist. It has been oppressive. It is, as you said quite rightly, associated with unemployment. It is associated with the suppression of people and so on, of course. But on the other hand, I think it's only in certain particular historical conjunctures that capitalism feels the need to, in fact, become overtly oppressive, and also, in that sense, overtly interested in dividing the people.
Hmm.
And that, in particular, is the period of crisis, period of mass unemployment, and so on. So that is, it's not. capitalism always has unemployment, but it's not always fascist.
Mm-hmm.
Only when the unemployment reaches very high levels, when you have mass unemployment, like in the Great Depression. After all, fascism in the 1930s began at the time of the Great Depression because of huge unemployment. Now, similarly, neo-fascism, which is how I would describe contemporary fascism, is something which has actually emerged at a time of substantial unemployment caused by the crisis of neoliberal capitalism.
Mm-hmm. And like again, when in Pakistan, we quite often talk about fascism, and the situation and the discussions. They are on the one side, you see people who are uh, arguing against, for example, blasphemy. If you ask a person who is a PTI supporter what is wrong with the system, he would say everything is perfect, just Nawaz Sharif is wrong. And like this blaming thing and not talking about the system is actually still with us and quite dominant. And I'm like seeing these analysis for the first time, and I don't see any person in Pakistan who makes this point to point to the system, which is actually making us what we are currently, like as we are today. There is another point that I wanted to discuss with you. You said not just now that this neoliberalism actually weakened the system, weakened the state to play any substantial role in the lives of the people. So we could say that this may have happened in the US as well. But again, when it comes to the global south, don't you think that the state is actually weakened even if there is no neoliberal system because of the influences or the remnants of colonialism and imperialism?
No, I mean, I think neoliberalism is the mechanism
Mm-hmm,
through which imperialism makes its a reappearance.
mm-hmm,
You have a re-emergence of the domination of imperialism that occurs by imposing the neoliberal regime on countries like ours.
mm-hmm,
Okay, so that neoliberalism, I would say, is the manifestation of the reassertion of imperialist hegemony.
mm-hmm,
Okay. So
mm-hmm.
I would not draw a distinction between imperialism and neoliberalism because of this particular factor.
Oh, actually, I was once taking a course, and the point that was made in the course that these third world Muslim majority countries cannot play any role in the lives of the people because they are not as developed. Now, there was no reference to the system of colonialism, but like from that standpoint, I thought that if the states are weakened in the global south, let's say, for example, Pakistan, it is weakened perhaps because we had that experience of colonialism like before 1947, and neoliberalism is just an addition to that.
Well, no, I don't agree with that because
Mm-hmm,
after all, it is true that colonialism leaves countries of the third world naturally weakened, deprived of resources, and so on. But on the other hand, many of them were making very rapid strides after decolonization.
mm-hmm,
China has made very rapid strides. Of course, China was not directly colonized, but it was a semi-colony. Similarly, I think even India was making fairly rapid strides, admittedly with all kinds of flawed uh, it was a system that could not overcome the unemployment that we had inherited and so on. But on the other hand, while it was a flawed system, nonetheless, it was really making rapid strides compared to the colonial past.
mm-hmm,
So, compared to the colonial past, many third world countries were making very rapid strides.
mm-hmm,
Now, if that is the case, then I think those strides are halted and reversed, not for the population, I mean, not for the big capital and for the urban middle classes, the affluent urban middle classes, but those strides are really reversed as far as the bulk of the population is concerned. I gave you figures about food grains output per
mm-hmm,
capita, which obviously also means that the condition of the peasantry,
mm-hmm,
the condition of the peasantry was improving for a very long time. Maybe not as rapidly as one would like and so on, but it was improving. While now, in the neoliberal period, the peasantry has been a victim of the neoliberal regime. One indication of this is the vast numbers of peasant suicides which have
Mm-hmm.
happened in India.
Yeah, yeah,
In
yeah,
nearly 3 to 400,000 peasants have committed suicide in the last 3 decades.
yeah. So this would be, I think, the last point about fascism. When I was listening to you, said that one thing which is new about this new fascism is that now it is added by those thugs, those people on the street. So can you talk us a bit about that, about this aspect of this new fascism as well? So it's not just about the state, but the thugs of the street as well.
No, you see, there's a fundamental difference between authoritarianism and fascism. Authoritarianism is not something which is a popular movement, while fascism attempts to be a popular movement. But on the other hand, while it is a popular movement that mobilizes people and so on, at the same time, those are the very people who are suffering from unemployment, who are
Yeah,
suffering from hunger and so on. Therefore, uh, those people can also be weaned away from fascism.
yeah.
Okay. So I mean, like for instance, even to this day in India, the neo-fascists would not really have a majority support
Mm-hmm.
in the country as a whole. Uh, as a matter of fact, the last parliament election showed that they lost heavily in the parliament elections. They lost at least 60 seats in the parliament. So the point is that the whole idea of the progressive forces must be to mobilize people around an alternative agenda, an alternative agenda that actually spells out a program of economic betterment for them, building
Mm-hmm.
a welfare state. But
Yeah.
all that, for reasons I've just discussed, is something which requires going beyond neoliberalism.
Neoliberalism. So
Yeah.
this would be my last question, and I think it's a bit personal. So I hope you will not mind it. And
No, no.
so like I was expecting Utsa Patnaik as well. So this was like for both of you.
Uh,
You two have authored books, brilliant books, and together,
uh.
how Marxism played its role in your relationship?
Sorry,
Like,
how? Uh, huh?
like, like how Marxism played its role in your relationship. Like, if there was,
Marxism.
if there was no Marxism, would you two have been as close as you are?
The point is that we were, for reasons I told you, my father being an activist of the Communist Party, I was exposed to Marxism quite early. And particularly when I was doing my master's and so on, in the syllabus, we had to study Marx and history of economic thought and so on. And similarly, she was also exposed to Marxism quite early, though she does not come from a communist background. Therefore, a certain sympathy for Marxism and a sympathy for a progressive political economic position is something which has been common and which we have had. Mind you, you must not forget that, we belong to a generation, say in my college days, everybody was progressive.
Okay,
Everybody was in
okay,
some sense left because India had been decolonized kind of just a few years earlier. And so, somebody may be an Nehruvian left, somebody may be a communist left, somebody may be a
yeah,
socialist left, somebody may be Gandhian left, but everybody really was in some sense imbued with a progressive attitude. That changed considerably with neoliberalism because obviously this was, if you like, full-blooded capitalism
yeah,
dominated by the metropolis being inducted into our societies.
yeah.
But a general sympathy for the left and the general sympathy for Marxism, the general sympathy for the conditions of the poor is something that really informs our lives.
Okay, and like this would be certainly my last question. So I'm sorry for taking more time.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like if there are two person who are as close to each other and they both are scholar, so what would they discuss most of the time? Marxism, economics, these issues, those scholarly discussions.
No, we discuss all kinds of things, including films or this or that, but also songs. But yes, Marxism and let's say the political situation and so on obviously enters quite a lot into a discussion.
Yeah.
But that I do with my friends also.
Yeah.
In other words, you cannot live in contemporary India without really being completely concerned about the kind of people who are ruling us. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah.
so
It's true.
that necessarily enters all conversation, including conversation with one's spouse.
Yeah. So thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. I personally, like one of as I told you that I am not from a background when it comes to education. I am satisfied with, like, I'm not at all satisfied with the sort of education I was provided with, and I see a great value in this conversation because I personally learn a lot. So thank you so much for your time, for your ideas, and I will one day put these ideas in front of the people in Pashto language as well in my vlogs. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir.
No, thank you very much. Thank you for your patience for asking me all these questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much,
Okay.
sir. Thank you, sir.
Goodbye. All the best.
Okay, sir.